Let everybody in. Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. Just take a virtual seat while we let everyone hop in. And we'll be started in just a few seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. All right, thank you everybody, and welcome to this is now the 5th talk in the spring 2023 Sara Little Turnbull Visiting Designer Lecture Series, where we've been talking to various luminaries in the world of activism, design, the sciences, and today we're going to be talking to an artist. This semester we'll be focusing on design specifically through a queer lens, queer representation in the design industry and in the arts, and how the products of those industries are inclusive of queer and non-binary users and audiences. This series is running concurrently with the Lehman College Art Gallery's current exhibition, Queer Love, Affection, and Romance in Contemporary Art, which presents paintings and photographs that illuminate both individual and universal stories of vulnerability, tenderness, and desire in the LGBTQIA+ community. It opened on February 14th and it closes on April 28th. And I would also say that the artist who we have with us today is in this show in the rotunda of the art gallery. And it occurs to me that isn't really photography or painting. It's like illustration. I want to talk about that today with our guest. So I would say that the show is probably mixed media. It's probably a better way to describe it. This lecture series is also a direct component of an interdisciplinary LGBTQIA+ design course that focuses on LGBTQ issues in design. These students are here today, some of them, and will be interacting with us hopefully through the Q&A section. And as always, this series is open to the public, so anyone is welcome to please ask questions through the Q&A. So now our guest today, David Rios Ferriera, has exhibited in galleries and museums in the US and abroad, including Coca in Seattle, Nemeth Art Center in Park Rapids, Minnesota, and Kunstrom Richard Sohr Gallery in Berlin, Germany. He has held residencies at the Lower East Side Print Shop, the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, and the Center for the Book Arts. These are all in New York. Rios Ferriera has participated in professional development programs such as Emerge 11 at Alhira in Newark, New Jersey, and the Bronx Museum Artists in the Marketplace, or AIM program. His awards include a New Jersey State Council on the Arts Fellowship, the Innovative Cultural Advocacy Fellowship from the Caribbean Culture Center, Africa and Diaspora Institute, a National Association, you have too many awards, a National Association of Latino Arts and Culture Fund for the Arts Grant, and the Art Slant Grand Prize. Recent exhibitions include Bronx Calling, the 4th Artist in the Marketplace Biennial at the Bronx Museum of the Arts, and By Each Crime and Every Kindness, its Sunroom Project Space at Wave Hill, here in the Bronx, Uproot at Smack Mellon in Brooklyn, and Mirrored by Nature at Wellham Cora Gallery, also in Brooklyn. David Rios Ferriera holds a BFA from the Cooper Union, a really well-known design school. So welcome, David. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your work with us.
Thanks for having me. Great to see everyone, and I'm super honored to be one of the visiting speakers for the Sara Little Turnbull series. So thank you.
Yes, of course. We're lucky to have you. Thank you. So so you have a lot of work. You have a piece in the gallery here, but you also have a sort of breadth of work to show us that I kind of wanted to look at. So would you mind showing us some of your
So what I'll do before I share my screen, just give everyone just a little bit more context. I'll
Sure.
go over sort of a little bit of the way in which I work and more about my practice, and then go into how the work has evolved and actually influence what ended up being what I ended up producing for the rotunda at the Lehman College Art Gallery.
Yeah.
So give me a minute to share my screen.
Sure.
Right. Hopefully, David, you can see that, right?
Yes, I can see that. Yeah, and that is the space in the rotunda that I'm looking at. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that I'll give you all a little bit of a preview before I get into that. But yeah. So
Sure.
thank you again for that great intro, and thank you for having me to this talk. Again, my name is Rios Ferriera. I'm a visual artist, working primarily in drawing, but that ends up, and you'll see very soon how that evolves into larger works, installations, sculptures, and potentially video in the future.
Okay.
A lot of my work takes from a variety of sources. I appropriate a lot of my work from anything from children's books to uh, children's book illustration, comic books, children's coloring books, 18th century etchings, political cartoons. And with regards to the more historical references, I'm really interested in imagery, especially things like etchings and the variety of lines we get from 18th century reports, specifically things you might find in a newspaper. And with regards to the political cartoons, specifically cartoons that sort of illustrate and demonstrate American imperialism upon its territories. So to back up a little bit, a lot of my work is influenced by my own upbringing. I identify as a queer artist. I am my family's from Puerto Rico. I call myself a mainland Puerto Rican. Born and raised in New York, partially in the Bronx, partially Queens, New York. And with that, it was very early on where I learned a little bit about the history of Puerto Rico and just how complex that is. So in part, my obsession with history comes from the realization that my parents were subject to deculturalization practices that were conducted by the US on the island's children, starting from kindergarten. That practice started on or around 1917 and went into, basically continued into impact children and college, even up to college level into the 70s. And my parents were subject to that, and they were impacted by that in a way that I think is quite insidious, in that it was very much a part of the daily life. So children would salute the American flag. The Puerto Rican flag was not allowed in the classroom. Children would be made to salute the American flag, and you would be made to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And then if you behaved, you were allowed to enjoy, songs and poems that were written by mainland Americans to, again, infuse a more American culture into the island's children. The figuring was that they couldn't do that to the adults, that there was going to be too much resistance by the grown-ups. And they thought if they continued to impact the children, it would just become this natural part of their culture. So one of these poems is, again, if they behaved, and after, again, this would happen in the morning after they said, do the Pledge of Allegiance, they get to say this poem. Puerto Rico is a beautiful island. It belongs to the United States. Its children speak English and Spanish and salute the flag every day. And that would be a reward. That would be something that you would be rewarded with. But again, just in listening to those words, you get to see sort of how subtle that is, and how the use of the familiar was a way to impact this group. Another thing that's a huge influence in the work is in the Caribbean, and specifically in places like Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, this idea of the mestizaje, which is this the notion that we are a mixed race, and our culture is informed by the enslaved people who were brought over from West Africa to the islands. the indigenous Taino that
Mhm.
resided originally on the islands, who go even further back, are came from the Arawak
Okay.
in southern and northern parts of the United States.
Right.
And then you have the Spanish and the European influences. So those three identities, and even there's a mural in Puerto Rico called "The Three Faces of Puerto Rico" that demonstrates that in a little bit more illustrative way. Those ideas come into mind as So here I am now contemplating this history, and also kind of trying to consolidate how that starts to get buried and how to unearth it, but also being influenced by this notion that our cultures are of this mix, and how does that all come to be? These are all very abstract ideas. And for especially thinking about school children and the idea of deculturalization happening in the schools, I also have a lot of experience working with children. I happen to also work at the Children's Museum of Manhattan. I'm a director at the public programs. I'm a curator of their contemporary art series that they run. And so I'm always influenced by this idea of how do we take these very abstract ideas like culture, like race, like notions of education, notions of identity. And that was especially influenced by my nephews who are on the autism spectrum. They are nonverbal, but when they are, what they often do are repeating lines from their favorite children's movies,
Mm.
things that they watch over and over. And in many times, they will use language like a script line from their favorite film, but in the very accurate way to share a need or share an emotion or make a request, but they're doing so by pulling from these familiar cartoons.
Ah, hmm.
And so all that comes together in my work. So I'm pulling
That's
children's
interesting.
material, I'm pulling this history together. And in many ways, what you're seeing right now in this slide is sometimes all these things come together to form new bodies and to form new landscapes and new hybrid forms. And that's sort of how I see how we operate in the world. Here we are floating around with all these things that make up who we are. And I'm trying to sort of grasp that through drawing, through the layers of line work that belong to others, right? I feel like there's this connection by when I'm tracing existing images from historical reference all the way down to pop culture, I'm pulling in a little bit of them into this work. Um, Before I move on to the next slide, these last two slides sort of what also how this work culminates also in these beings, and what I sometimes call them temporal beings or time beings, because I feel like they're coming in and out of time. I'm channeling them through this discourse of history and pop culture to create these figures that are partially influenced by a carnival figure we have in Puerto Rico called the Vejigante. And the Vejigante is this horned tooth character that is made up. There's a variety of ways in which the masks and the costumes are made, but the notion is that we are pulling these things together, these very familiar materials together to create a new form, a new body. And a lot of that carnival culture comes from places like West Africa. We also see of influences in Haiti and Dominican Republic,
Hmm.
where you
Hmm.
take these familiar materials, these very accessible materials like paper, cardboard, string, and you're embodying them with a spiritual power and a political power.
Yeah.
There is examples of where these costume characters, while in their fun, are criticizing the state of things in their
Yeah.
countries.
Yeah.
So I was really attracted to that when I create these new forms. So as I said, I'm really attracted to drawing in line and love what happens when these things intersect. And that's why when I talk about how these things come together to create new forms, what are these forms? I kind of keep the idea of the body pretty open. And so I was really interested in this work, where how does that card start to happen in a three-dimensional space?
Uh,
How does that start to happen where we layer all these lines, all these references that I brought up? And again, references that when I refer to the mestizaje and my own mixed race identity, all those elements, all those stories of, we're talking about, elements from the Middle Passage. We're talking about political cartoons that depicted Puerto Ricans as animals or other, and all these different things come together to create these compositions. And for these sculptural compositions, this is, a layering of transparencies, again, having a more scholastic reference. These are things, depending on your age and depending on how you grew up in elementary school, I know I did. We had transparencies. Basically, these projectors would project the teacher's notes or illustrations for us to all see. Now you all have really awesome smart boards and all that stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
but I like that idea of using those kind of materials. You'll see more references to the scholastic and the academic in my work. That again, always harping back to that moment, those many moments in Puerto Rico and in other places, even in the U.S., where the education system, and the idea of the space for children of learning was a way to, and essentially commit cultural genocide.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just a zoom in one of those sails, so to give you a sense of how these things come together. Again, the transparencies were layered on top of other sheets of plexi and other forms of plastic in order to create that layered effect. Um, Sailing ships, merchant ships, slave ships, pirate ships. This is a very almost innocuous image that carries so many different meanings and so many different layers. And I'm really attracted to that when I start to create these new forms and these new bodies. So as I started to think about how drawing would evolve from the flat image, and even in the flat image, I was always interested in space. A lot of the earlier work that with Mylar allows sort of this illusion that it's floating in space. Um, I then started to see how these drawings would then start to take up the three-dimensional space in actual architecture. And so, as you mentioned earlier in the introduction, one of my first
Right.
installations was at Wave Hill in the Bronx for their sunroom project. This is the sun porch. Um, and what you typically would see through these windows is a view of the Hudson. And so this was the first time where I was thinking about all the history that I was interested in, and thought about how am I anchoring my work within a specific space and the history that that space embodies. And so looking at through these windows, thinking about the Hudson River, thinking about Henry Hudson's ride up the river, the various encounters, both violent and non-violent interactions with the indigenous people, the indigenous Lenape, what, those interactions, what happened? What were the emotional, psychological complexities around those encounters? And
Mm.
what residue of that was left behind when we look at this landscape. What I also wanted to do as someone who was a youth growing up in New York, never knowing about this space, and there's many other spaces like it that are ours, that belong to us, that we are part of that community. I wanted to welcome in the youth perspective. And so we invited and worked with both teens who worked at Wave Hill, but also Casita Maria, teens who worked at Casita Maria, which is so not too far actually from, I know some Lehman artists who go and teach there as well. And what I did with them is that I gave them all the same sources, so those earlier images I showed you, all the references, I gave them all those references. I invited them to bring more of their own references, their own drawings, their own writings, and they formed this landscape. So their lines, their blue lines, form the entire landscape that we decided would take over the true landscape that you would see through those windows. In fact, while I was installing, I had, it was somewhat open to the public, so members and people who frequent the space would come through and see me covering the windows, and I could tell there's a sense of tension that you're covering the view. But it was important, right? That act of reimagining our history, reimagining ourselves in a space was important for that project.
Yeah, a space that traditionally excluded people of color too. I mean, it had been owned and built by white
and it was
men.
private, right? And
Yeah, it was a private
home.
residence. Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Okay.
a property, if anyone's been, it's pretty massive when you think about how that belonged to a family.
Yep, a single family. Yeah, no, it's shocking nowadays, especially.
So from that project, I was then invited by Elizabeth Ferrer, who's the head curator at Brick, to be a part of what they call the Cafe Mural series. And so they had, I believe it was maybe every 6 months or more, artists would come in and reimagine the cafe that you get at Brick. And this is something that you see when you're into the space. You can see it through the windows. Right now this shot doesn't have any of the tables and chairs, but again, this is a space where people were spending time. And so so when it was brought on again, I this is funny how artists will often I mean, at least what I say for myself is that I'd love to move on past one idea or past a rule that I've given myself. But sometimes that rule or that little bit of structure that I give myself helps me focus on how I can either advance the work in this new space or stay, and most importantly, stay anchored in why, why this work needs to look different, and what could evolve from learning more about that space. So it turns out that location where Brick is actually was one of the first working movie theaters in the US.
Oh, wow.
And I loved that idea. And then I just used that as a spiral. Like I kind of talked to people about even how I find my images. I'm kind of on a word association brain. I pick an image, and then if I Google where that image comes from, then it keeps spiraling into more and more resources, and I end up unearthing histories and references that I didn't even know were there. So
Yeah.
learning about this being a movie theater, I thought, okay, what was my relationship to movies? And I mean, obviously, I look at a lot of children's movies, and children's cartoons are certainly important to the work. But then I was also thinking about that space and the location and that area, that specific area in Brooklyn, and um, definitely a lot of friends that I have that live there, and also people that I've known that once lived there, but were in many ways forced to move or had no choice but to move. And thinking about how complex this idea of gentrification is, and how
Mm.
for some that there's this bizarre, I don't say bizarre, but for some there's this benefit while others are suffering from the impact, and how things can change and things quote unquote become cleaner, but then what else has happened, what's being removed as a result. And so I thought about this city landscape that was being affected by change, and that change is both maybe beautiful, quote
Mm.
unquote, air quotes, or is it taking over and is it becoming monstrous? And I thought about I thought about the movies that I enjoyed watching as a kid and the kind of time I spent with my family. And every Sunday after church, which is a weird fact, every Sunday after church, they would on live TV, they'd be playing one of the many Godzilla movies.
Uh-huh.
And so I thought about these, otherworldly creatures sort of having this battle royale, but not for really for us, not really knowing, well, who's really the good guy and who's the bad guy.
Right.
Um, and all the ways in which the smaller figures or the way the landscape was impacted by these changes.
Interesting. Wow.
And then, I just been really privileged from that point. So that the brick mural opened, and then very shortly, unfortunately, we were all impacted by the closures and COVID, and the shelter in place. And so it was up for a little while. I'm not sure how much longer it was when they reopened, but that's I've been very privileged in the last few years to be approached for more projects that really forced me to think about these drawings that essentially lived on 18 by 24 sheets of paper, or even large
Yeah.
mylar, how they embody and take impact space. So in 2021 I was invited by Meta and Facebook to do to create artwork for their offices that they were just started to renovate and move into at Hudson Yards in New York.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and I'll be mindful of time. I won't linger as much on all of these, but again, thinking about space, thinking about the history. For those who are familiar with Hudson Yards area, that part of that is you have the High Line, which was once a railway track, and again, that
Right.
styled me into, okay, well, what was that relationship to the community there historically, and learning about that before the High Line track existed, the train actually drove on the ground, and
Mm.
had unfortunate accidents. I mean, people were at that point. There was a heavily populated Italian and Polish immigrant sector in that area of the city, and so very little was being paid attention to the many accidents and quite frankly deaths that were being occurred by this train that was running through. And then
Mm.
learning, so there's that history that we're not too familiar with, and then, well, how did the city respond? They went and got cowboys. They got cowboys from the west to ride their horses ahead of the train, almost like as a crossing guard to let people know that the trains were coming. And so those kind of things, I won't go in and point out where that ends up in the work, but and in general, I thought, okay, I would just want a big old train to bust through Facebook's office, and that was sort of like
Absolutely.
that was my goal. Um, and lots of detail. This is also one of the first works where I do incorporate a lot of collage in my smaller works, or medium-sized works even. But prior to this moment, I've been working with fabricators or muralists, but this time I really wanted to think about how collage in that three-dimensional form would appear. And so for this piece, actually, there's somewhat three dimensions that are occurring, where elements are floating against this line drawing that's again depicting that train that's busting through the space.
And what are the materials you're using especially for these 3D pieces? I'm interested. Like, what is all this? What are the media that you're using?
And it's a great segue into the kind of material that's in the works at the Rotunda. I
Yeah.
discovered this, indoor sign material, the kind of material you would use. You could work with staples and
Sure.
get these printouts. What I liked is that the quality was very matte, and it
Yep.
had just a beautiful. I mean, I'm someone who loves drawing. Like, I love surfaces. I love things that are, maybe outside of the realm of paper, but even paper having so many varieties. This allowed for the photographic element to be just as matte as my drawing could be, but also
Okay.
add a nice satin finish and dimension to the work. And
Yeah.
similarly, these works were also created with that same material. This is
Wow.
probably my most recent solo exhibition at the Utah Museum of Fine Arts. And again, I'm kind of leaning towards talking a lot about how my work has transitioned to a lot of site-specific work. So while this was an exhibition space and a gallery in the museum, the gallery, specifically the Acme Lab gallery that it resided in, it coincides with the education department. And so there was really this important aspect to the exhibitions connecting to the community. And so I had the privilege of working with Dene Chandine, who is my partner out there, who this is out by Salt Lake, Utah, who did a
Mm-hmm.
lot of work and advocacy work and research around the really the epidemic of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls that is happening throughout this country.
Right. Right.
Salt Lake City being one of
The hot spots. Yeah.
one of the many, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so while these works aren't specific to people, however, they were inspired by one individual that I grew up knowing, and learning about this idea of using this work, this idea of pulling in history and space, and sort of cultural detritus, so like cartoon imagery and all that. How do we start to use those almost as tools, the way the teens use that to create a new landscape? I wanted this audience to think about how I might use these things, and how they were actually encouraged also in the exhibition to create their own, what we call portals. The idea of using all these elements as a tool to create this, fictional narrative that if we had the ability to transcend time and space and reach those we loved, which was a line inspired from, if anyone's a fan of Interstellar, it's one of the speeches, one of the monologues in
Yeah.
the movie. It was really inspiring to think that, like, beyond light bending and time, that the idea that love could actually go beyond. When someone's passed, you're still loving them despite their not existing in our three-dimensional space.
Yeah.
So I loved that idea, and that was the impetus for the show, to think about how that coincide with a beautiful piece of writing by Dene on indigeneity and the way that the impact of loss, and how that coincides with our current notions of science fiction, but also future, the idea of the future.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to move on. This is another larger piece. Very quickly, actually, I'll go back to. So each of these portals were lines from Beyonce songs by someone who I thought about, who had been lost to violence, and they were big. They, in fact, they wanted to be called Beyonce. They referred to themselves as Beyonce, and so just as an ode to that person, each of these rings is a line from one of the songs. And then this one, did you see me? Did you hear me? Did you hear her? Did you hear us? Did you find me? Comes from the advocates and the demonstrations that are done throughout the country. Some of this language is in the signage around the lack of response from the U.S. government and the authorities to investigate some of these many of these missing in our
Yeah.
indigenous communities. This is a much more recent mural that I did for, and this relates. I promise everyone this relates. This comes back to the Lehman College show.
That's okay. You don't have to. You don't have to. You don't have to swing it around. We love it. This is great.
Well, no, because it does. I mean, I wanted to show everyone sort of funny, like this timeline. Like, so while I'm talking to Lehman College and Bartholomew about what we're going to do, I'm also
Yeah.
approached by this company called Spence Chapin. They're a nonprofit. They're actually where I was able to adopt my daughter.
Oh.
They knew I was an artist. They were changing locations. They moved to, they were on the Upper East Side, and then moved to more of the Union Square area, and invited me and my husband to collaborate on a site-specific work for their new office. So Kaya's garden, Kaya's my daughter, and this work was thinking a lot about that, really, the idea of building my family and what the institution does to help families build their families, the way they support many women who are making decisions and making adoption plans for their children. And so it was just interesting how while I'm working on this piece, I am now, developing work for the Rotunda.
Yeah.
So for the Rotunda, I, just that shape, right? Such a unique shape. And a lot of you who've gone in person, whether you've seen this show or others, it's just such a unique architectural, thing. It's just really cool.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to speak to that. I wanted to somehow relate to that. And I kept walking around in a circle, and I kept thinking about, the way one might walk through a church or walk through meditation or walk through some form of, self reflection, and thinking about the exhibition and the theme and how I felt, being, me and my husband being gay parents and being people who had to go through a very different set of hoops in order to qualify and earn, honestly, I've been saying this recently, earn my daughter. I couldn't just have her. I had to earn. There were so many things that we had to do to earn her and earn the privilege to be able to have a child. And how even there, right, there's all these complexities. So it was actually during the Utah show, and a similar talk to this, where a person, the curator, Jorge Rojas, had asked about, we had to talk about future and futurisms and Afrofuturisms and indigeneity and the way in which culture, the way we see cultures and how that influences our future. It was an interesting question around being queer and the idea of a cyborg and the idea of adopting. And so I couldn't get that out of my head. And I thought, okay, I wanted to make these church windows, and these church windows are going to show these, if anyone's a Star Trek fan, these Borg-like beings, these non-binary, non-gendered creatures with little ones, and presenting them in ways that are very similar to imagery we see in, these stories of the birth of Jesus. And so in a way, I'm inviting you to this church that's in the Rotunda, and I call it the Commission for the Cybernetic Artificial Church of the Queer Immaculate Reception. Very deliberate with my words. I'm happy to answer any questions about that, but I did want to show, so each window, each sort of fictionalized stained glass window is representative of one of these layers in the story. So you have the nativity, you have the adoration, the annunciation, and the epiphany, all layers, specifically annunciation. If people are not familiar, that's when an angel came down and told Mary that she was going to bear the child of God, right? And I just, even those stories, so it's the idea of calling each of these windows one of these elements. If you have some of that background of those religious stories, how that relates. I mean, I think about how, the quote unquote unusual and not usual way in which Mary had a child. And and adoption and building a family and being ostracized, and and on the other hand, I think of these are very queer narratives and queering that narrative and owning that, and quite frankly thinking about, my daughter is awesome. So yeah, I think this is divine.
That is such a fascinating take on it, because there's so much about, I think, contemporary Christianity that's maligned, and other religions, not just Christianity, but
Right.
certainly Christianity is maligned to be anti-LGBT or anti-queer, especially nowadays. And yet, if you look at, and one of the critiques of like a gay couple might be, well, that they can't have children or they can't bear
Mhm,
children.
mhm.
But I mean, married, as you just alluded to, didn't have a child through sexual relations with her husband. It was like it was magic, I guess. It's like a given to her by God, and almost
Well,
like an adoption.
right, and all to say, and I'd be really interested. I'm sure that there might be
Yeah,
people on this talk who have an opinion, but really the
sure.
idea was to really shake up that narrative a little bit and really own it for myself, as own it for me
Hmm.
and my husband. And this is another, like the adoption agency. This was another collaboration between
Yep.
Neil Fernando and I, and um, it was really important to think about how we related to those narratives and how we could also depict, especially when we talk about the title of the show, Queer Love, how with the way in which I make my work, the way in which he makes his work, um, it's not as clear and representational as some of the other examples you see in the show. How are we depicting and talking about queer love? And also, how can we change that too? Right? How can
Yeah.
we be a little bit more um, open and abstract about the ways in which we demonstrate that and through art making and in this case, we're talking about a little bit about design. Um,
Yeah.
so very quickly, what I showed you all earlier were the digital drawings that I did that accompanied a lot of things like watercolor, broad line
Yeah.
drawing, acrylic paint, that then all came together to create those images. And then on site, going in and adding those that collage, that similar that similar material that I talked about for the Facebook piece, where I wanted to build a little bit more dimension in the space. So when you walk in, these things are not quite as flat on the wall. They're a little bit three-dimensional. They're curling. They're
Yeah.
almost kind of alluding to the idea of real foliage. The way in which you think about old churches or churches that have the beautiful ivy, and again,
Right.
thinking about architecture, thinking about how we are engaging in this space, both looking at art but also embodying that space with the art. So
Yeah.
I was always interested in that blurred line between drawing, painting, and sculpture, and how I love when artists start to blur those lines, and that's something I'm interested in doing too.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there for now.
Yeah.
I'm excited to talk more. And
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank you. This is great. I have questions, but I wanted to first talk about in what influences you, because I mean, you kind of went into some of the influences, but these chapel windows, for example, it kind of reminds me of Matisse's Rosary Chapel work that he did with his
Mhm.
cutouts later in life. I mean, he was like confined to a wheelchair, and his only means of image making was by cutting out gouache on paper.
Mhm.
Just
Mhm.
like and he was commissioned by the Rosary Chapel in the south of France, I believe, to create like the chapel windows. And it's a really beautiful but very non-traditional decoration. Um, and I found that kind of interesting. And I was wondering if and there's that. So there's this idea of Matisse and sort of his views on things, but also there's like a lot of interesting things in here that remind me of graffiti art. I don't know how, I know you were born and raised in the Bronx, and of course there is a lot of, there's some notable graffiti and graffiti artists that have come from the Bronx. Uh, Somebody, I think he's West Coast, but Futura, are you
Mm,
familiar with
mhm.
Futura? So
Yeah.
some of this kind of reminds me of Futura and his work with the allusions to robots and
Mhm.
aliens. So I wanted to ask you about just who you're influenced by, who inspires you, and where you sort of got some of these things that are floating in your pieces.
Mm. I mean, well, so my influences run pretty wide.
Hmm.
I mean, I think still very much influenced by the work of Julie Meritu, um, whose work really, again, like dovetails between drawing and painting, and really this idea of lines and layers being pulled in, specifically in her case, many times architecture
Yeah,
and interiors, and how she redefines that. And still, as someone, she's originally from Ethiopia,
yeah,
how that very idea, like how those things relate and how she thinks about um that with regards to line. I just really,
Hmm.
and
Yeah, I could see that.
also I just love her work and think she's
Yeah,
phenomenal.
I can
Um,
see that.
Someone that's actually up right now at the new museum, Wenge Chimutu, is another huge influence. And I think like many artists, and what they have in common, and a lot of artists that I think from the diaspora, from the Caribbean, there's this interesting thread and through line of the idea of the hybrid and the idea of the made figure and redefining the figure and redefining space
Yeah,
through abstraction sometimes or through hybridity,
yeah,
um, that I'm really excited about. Uh, the painter just escapes me, but there's a number of abstract painters that came out of Cuba from, I want to say in like the 40s and 50s that I look at a lot.
yeah,
And actually also I also like letting people know too, I'm almost more sometimes influenced by outsider artists and outsider art,
yeah.
or what people call outsider
y-
artists and outsider art. Specifically the artist Judith Scott, who
Okay.
I believe she had, unfortunately
Yeah,
she has passed, but
yeah,
had she had Down syndrome, but she was also hearing impaired, and made these really beautiful abstract objects, but
mm,
actually were objects that were out and about in the world around her, and she would wrap them in so many different colors with ropes and ribbons. And so the end product would be this amorphous, beautiful wrapped thing, but you never knew what was
yeah,
inside. And I knew that her estate later on would take MRIs of these objects to see what was inside. And there were jokes. I think it's the gallery's called Creative Growth. It's a studio out west in California that works with artists of various abilities to create work and give them space and assistance to create their work. And Judith created a lot of work there. Um, and I remember just this fun story about, I think you just couldn't leave if you left your cell phone out, if you left your shoe out, she was worked so quietly and so quickly, things would disappear into her work. And I just love that
that's amazing.
idea,
Yeah,
right? That idea that we're taking things that are so familiar, and in many ways, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that's a tool in which we as viewers are drawn in. And
yeah.
that's an opportunity to have a discussion and to have and
That's
to talk about it.
it's a really good point because like for me and how I grew up with like manga and Voltron and like some
Mhm.
I'm like looking at these and
Mhm.
I see little like references to manga and robots and stuff. And it's so my question would be if you're using like cultural tokens and you're kind of collaging them, would you qualify this as pop art? Like, is it in that realm to you, or is this something different?
I don't know. That's kind of a funny question because, I mean, in a weird way, where we are now, culturally, what wouldn't be pop art,
Right.
right? Like
That's a good answer. Yeah.
I think we
Yeah.
all take for granted how visual our environment is and how
Yeah.
quickly we can access images. When you
Yeah.
think about TikTok or Instagram or Google or YouTube, you name it, we have access to so much information and so much visual information, and at such short periods and rapidly. So
Yeah.
now, how can you distinguish what you're being influenced by?
Yeah.
So for people who are really freaked out by that, yeah, it really bothers them. But on the one hand, it's kind of cool to think about
Yeah.
how that's going to influence visual culture.
Yeah. I mean, well, I was wondering, the idea of like copyright entered my mind. Like, do you sort of skirt copyright issues? Like, how does that, do you
Yeah, I
even,
mean, you see my face. I don't
yeah,
know.
yeah.
I don't know.
I could see the
I
body language.
I think on the one hand, a lot of the work is in very public educational spaces on the one hand.
Yeah.
On the
So,
other,
you know,
I don't I'm I don't what's that saying? I can't deny nor
right. Nor confirm.
confirm
Yeah.
that
Right.
you're seeing what you're seeing. So those are great references that you brought up, David. But but that's you, right? That's what you're bringing to
That's
the
I'm
work,
bringing that to the table. Yeah.
right?
I mean, it kind of it's interesting because I think it's great because it creates this dialogue between almost like science, like as you said, like science fiction fantasy, which is not a real thing, it's an imagined thing. And then 18th and 19th, well, even earlier, colonial history, which is a very real thing, which affects us to this
Mm-hmm.
day, a
Mm-hmm.
very grave thing that we're continuously struggling with to remedy. And then you combine them together and it creates this more, the synthesis of the two is like, turns out to be very fun, very engaging. Like you can't look away. It's like a train wreck, literally in some cases, because you have a piece. It's like based on a train, and it tells a story. And I was thinking, I mean, to me, that's fair use. So that falls into that category. So all that aside,
Well, and
but
I'll add to what you're saying
yeah,
too. You know, I think that's the complexity of the narratives that I'm even the historical these
yeah,
moments where very violent moments in our history,
yeah, yeah,
and many of us are the product of that history,
yep,
and
yep,
so it's that complexity of like we're beautiful, we are
yeah.
beautiful complex beings coming from a very trauma based
Really
history.
ugly place.
And
Yeah,
how do you, you know, I don't know the answer. And I think, making art is about constantly coming up with more and more questions sometimes. And
yep,
I don't have
absolutely.
an answer, and I don't even know if I want to find the answer, but that drives the aesthetic, right? So
Yeah,
I want you to find it beautiful and pretty, but I want maybe stop you to think about how complex and uncomfortable these things that I'm maybe alluding to or referencing, or maybe it's in the text, maybe it's in
yeah,
the work, maybe it's what you brought to the table that you're having to confront now, um, through beauty. And that's a very complex thing when we think about ourselves, right? It's to think
yeah,
about ourselves in a positive way despite some of the challenges that we face, or maybe the challenges that we've even encountered, or uh, have been the perpetrators of,
yeah.
right?
I guess that's my next question then is that what I love about your work is that there are all of those layers in there, but it's not obvious. The messaging is not obvious, right? And I was wondering, like, how do you balance this idea of the visual, like the aesthetic, with this political and historical thread? Like, do you think about it consciously? Does it just kind of happen? You got to balance it. Like there's this beautiful visual abstraction happening on one side of the spectrum, and then there's a very grave political discussion happening on another. Like how do you fall in that when you're making this work, or do you? I mean, does
Yeah,
it?
I mean, I think to some extent, it's either always on my mind, or it's part of the practice. It's in
Okay.
the readings that I'm doing, it's in the podcast I'm listening to, it's in the lectures
Yeah.
that I hear. Um,
Yeah.
it's the people I'm surrounded by, it's the other artists that I talk to.
Sure.
Um, it it's in the practice, and then sometimes it's also for me sometimes a good anchor point, so that I'm staying a little focused and staying a little bit more me, despite
Hmm.
where the work is going and where the work is being um, displayed. So it was a challenge. I would say it was challenging. The Utah show, this exhibition at Lehman College, and even the more recent adoption agency commission, like these, which can be challenging. I want to be really respectful to the audience that I am sharing space with,
Yeah.
and I want to speak to them. I want this to be for them, and I also want to be careful about what I'm referencing or what I'm influencing, especially if it's not necessarily if there's a direct correlation to my own personal experience. But at the same time, I have my tools. I know I have my toolbox of things that I use. And so how do I start to use that structure? And every artist is different, right? Every artist's practice is different. And it's just a series of exercises that I go through in getting a little bit more deep in the research, being connected with more people, conversations, um, but also confidence in my work, that I feel confident and excited about what I'm producing, knowing these things in the back of my mind. Um,
Yeah.
but I will say a part of it's also on the viewer. You know, I'm putting a lot out there,
Yeah.
um, and some of it comes through, and some of it, I mean, I love. I My favorite moments are when someone brings something new to the table. Again, because we're all coming with our own, and I mean this in a positive way, our own baggage. You know,
Right.
we're coming with our own baggage, and I think it's interesting to hear people talk about what they're seeing in the work, because sometimes maybe what I'm doing is just encouraging that exercise, that self-reflective exercise of taking a moment and thinking about your relationship to this imagery.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's very key. Um, I get you. You know, you actually just opened. I think you opened your presentation with this idea about deculturalization.
Mhm.
Um, and you also mentioned, in my mind it translated to cultural genocide immediately, but then you actually said cultural genocide. I'm like, okay, so, and I know they're related, um, but as you pointed out, cultural genocide has already, or deculturalization has already occurred, um, in Puerto Rico and elsewhere, but certainly in Puerto Rico and other U.S. protectorates, you know, Hawaii,
Mm-hmm.
Alaska,
Mm-hmm.
the Philippines, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera, right? Um, is it? I mean, can you? How is this happening in the same way with queer culture today? Do you see it happening in a way?
I
And
mean, it's like you can't today. I mean, I think like it's happening right now as we speak. I
as
mean,
we
it's
speak,
insane.
yeah,
It's insane what's
yeah,
this wave of attacks, specifically on the transgender community.
yeah,
And specifically, I think I go back to, you know, my experience working with children, and my experience my experience working with children, my experience with early childhood development and youth development, and understanding how we're developing as young people into adults, how complex and scary all that is. And there are people out there attacking that. That's
yeah,
what they're attacking. You know, they're attacking the ability to navigate who you are,
yeah,
and they're putting it into law. So it's happening.
hmm,
You know, I mean, it's
yeah.
really it's. I mean, I can't tell you any number of advocates and people out there. Just it's a plain, clean and clear attack
Yeah.
on the transgender community specifically.
And how can artists and designers fight back against this? Like, I mean, you are an artist who does so, obviously. I mean, it's clear from there's threads and through lines in your work that suggest you're doing that. But is there like, that's sort of part of what we've been talking about this semester, right? About design as a tool, and art and design, creativity as a tool to sort of, neuter this whole process of deculturalization that is going on in various state governments. And how can a designer, like, what chance does a designer have against state legislatures? You know, like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I
That's a
mean, that's a big question,
it's a big question. Yeah.
but like something people could do today. I mean, obviously, is reach out to their local governments, their local senators, but
Yeah.
as with regards to design, I mean, what's really interesting that I'm seeing a lot online and through social media is the way in which design is being used to share information. You
Mm.
know, I think sadly, no one wants to read. You
Hmm.
know, no one wants to read, and we're so used to very quick sound bites. So how
Yep.
do I get you this information? And I think if you look, I mean, anyone turns on their phone now, you could look at so many great examples of how information is being shared through design, through
Yeah.
information design, through graphic design. Um, and I don't mean some of it very text based and some of it illustrative, but
Yep.
it's happening right now. And I think that should and can continue as, you know, we try to really make sure that this information is being made available. And that, you know, I think I saw some really great work come out during the period in which um, people were being held at the border and caged
Yeah.
at the border, and all the related efforts to find people in the United States by knocking on doors. and
Yeah.
arresting you. Really great graphic design work that came out with newspapers, like newspaper format or comic book format, to non-verbally and not using even the English language describe what you can do and what you had your right, what was within your right to do to protect yourself.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
those are some
Yeah.
great examples of how graphic design was used to protect people.
Yeah. That's excellent. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This is very great. Let's leave it there. David, thank you for meeting with us today and sharing your work. It's if you guys haven't gone to the gallery yet and walked through, just walk through, you'll see the rotunda and you'll see David's work. Please do before it closes in April. David, thank you so much again for meeting with us.
Thank you, everybody.
And have a good weekend, everybody. And please join us next week where we'll have our final discussion here, and we will close out the semester. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.